You might be thinking to yourself, what on earth does an academic and a clergyman know about business and about business failure? So I want to talk a little bit about just a couple of case studies, and then I want to do something I suspect that will be completely different and novel to you most. I want to talk about a concept called obliquity, and I want to talk about a Canadian philosopher called Michael de Certeau, and do all of that in 15 minutes with wry wit and good humour, and my tongue slightly in my cheek, really, as is the custom, really. Now, as we're on a day of celebration today, I mean, of course, the FA Cup final, not that other event that's going on in Windsor, a football remark to begin with. It was said some years ago of David Beckham that he was invited to come back to his school to talk about football. And so you can imagine this global superstar, great footballer. And, everybody knows who he is. Back in his local school, the kids are just absolutely hushed. And he steps up to the microphone and he says the following. They're small, they're minty, they come in a variety of colours. They're mostly white, but you can get green and orange as well. And they come in packs of 50. And then he sat down. And there was a hush. And then the headmaster leant forward and said, Mr. Beckham, we asked you to talk about tactics. Just shows how badly wrong it can go, doesn't it? So I'm going to talk about tactics just a little bit. And in relation to that, I want to say something about a business that was growing and developing some years ago. Here's my stunning illustration of this. And it was two competitive businesses in the same town. One was relocating. So the other business, they didn't really get on well, decided that what would be really good would be to send a wonderful bouquet of flowers to his rival and competitor to wish him well in his new premises. So he rang the florist, ordered the flowers. Unfortunately, the florist got the order wrong, and what was sent instead was a wreath that said, with deepest sympathy, rest in peace. So the person who received the wreath phoned up his competitor and just gave him the full volley down the phone, absolutely furious and livid. And so, of course, the person who'd ordered the flowers then phoned the florist and gave it with both barrels down the phone. Well, said the florist, I'm really sorry. I can only apologise. Sometimes these things go very badly wrong. We've clearly screwed up. I humbly apologise. We will send an explanatory note and a new huge bunch of flowers to your competitor. But, sir, I would ask that you have some perspective in relation to this error on our part, because somewhere out there is a hearse with a bouquet on top of it with a message saying, congratulations on your successful relocation. So businesses do fail, even household names. And here I've got a little riff from Isaiah. The grass withers, the flower fades, but what abides forever? Actually, what does abide forever? If you go back to the FTSE index, which is now around about 30 years old, there are some notable absentees. MFI, nobody buys that anymore. You can't get it. It's a collector's item. But you can get IKEA, whatever became of Woolworths. Some of these things that were huge in the public imagination just go. And why do they go? It seems to me that there's something here in this conference and something here in the presentations that I've heard about the nature of mutuality. Mutuality is, I quote, a reciprocal relation between independent entities, objects, or individuals, or groups. Note the words, interdependent entities and reciprocity, reciprocal. It's there in our classic literature. John Donne. No one is an island. You and I are not complete. We need each other. One of the grave errors, it seems to me, sometimes of business is to assume that in the cause of domination, somehow completion and mastery can be gained. The lesson of humanity, beginning with that most ill-fated building project, the Tower of Babel, is that actually things don't work quite as you thought. Michael de Certeau has this to say. There's a difference between strategy and... Sorry, this is David Hare, actually, I beg your pardon. This is just about growth, actually. David Hare, the playwright. One Bradford and Bingley became a bank. I remember taking an immediate dislike to a new non-exec who said, the one thing we want from this company, he said, is what I want is regular incremental growth. In other words, he was saying this company must grow every year. Now, says Hare, we all know that nothing in the world shows regular incremental growth. You know that, and I know that. What we find, I think, in all of this is that there is a difference between organizations, strategy, tactics, and institutions. Strategy sometimes is the go-to place, the place of comfort for people who imagine that domination, control, and mastery is possible. If you just think about it for a moment, strategy, wonderful though it is, doesn't work for an enormous amount of human life. What is the strategy for your marriage? Seriously. What is the strategy for your family and your children? Most of us live and dwell in the world of tactics. And Michael de Certeau says this, a tactic is a calculated action determined by the absence of a proper locus. It does not, therefore, have the options of planning general strategy and viewing the adversary as a whole within a distinct, visible, and objectifiable space. In other words, sometimes all institutions and organizations can do is work through their tactics. Yep, they need objects, aims, core values, mission statements, visions, much else besides. But in fact, a large amount of what we do is tactical. And one of the reasons I love that story about the florist and the wreath and the bouquet is precisely because the florist has tactics. The strategy was wrong. So what can you and I do? Well, first of all, whatever you're doing, whatever you're running, know what you're leading and know whom you are serving. This is not as straightforward as it sounds, because we're looking after our workforce, but we're looking after our customers, and we're looking after the customers and their families and our public. And sometimes it strikes me that one of the most important things that we can do in any business or institution is just for the moment set strategy aside and instead put in its place another question. What is the mutuality of the institution and organization that I'm running or serving? And how does it do good, first and foremost? And what is the consequence of that good for what else we do? I can say more about that perhaps a little later or under the Q&A. So what of this concept of obliquity that I just wanted to mention just very briefly? I'm using here the work of a man called John Kay. And John Kay talks about obliquity as, in a sense, the consequence of doing things that we did not necessarily intend from the outset. Kay, in his book, talks about the fact that sometimes you can do things for all sorts of rational business sense reasons which make absolutely perfect sense to you and to me. They would fit well into a strategy, but they do unintended harm. On the other hand, sometimes we do things which actually we had no way of calculating the good about those, but it turns out that they are remarkably effective and efficient. I suppose the invention of the post-it note would be a particularly good way of looking at that, or any other kind of lean startup. But there's something striking in this about how we, as it were, think about the world around us. The people who put this building together in 1972 made some assumptions. This is, by the way, not an ill-fated Oxford College experiment, just in case you're wondering, really. although I think I have seen a building like this at Wadham. Anyway, never mind. The people who developed this made some assumptions about humanity. That human beings lived in spaces, that spaces were basically like machines, that houses were functional, and that you didn't need space to socialize, you didn't need wasted space, you did not need space in which to dwell and have conversations. You needed a small room to sleep in, a small room to eat in, a small room to cook in, and a small room to watch TV in. The consequence is what you see up on the screen. Sometimes wasting space or doing things that seem to have no purpose at all turns out to be the best thing of all. What Kay says in his book, talking about Charles Jenck and the work in 1972 of architecture, is that when actually architects learnt that houses were human habitations and that we needed space to chill, to live, to eat, to socialize, to expand, we started to see the space differently, and we did not build these industrial human chicken coops, which is what these effectively are. Bruce Reed, one of my favourite authors, 36 years ago now, in a book called The Dynamics of Religion, talks about bees and says this: if bees could talk and we came across them busy in a flower garden and inquired what they were doing, the bees would reply, gathering nectar to make honey. The bees need the honey. But if you ask the gardener, he or she would most certainly answer, they are cross-pollinating my flowers. Reed continues, the mutual dependence of bees and flowers is an analogue of organizations and society. In other words, put very simply, the bees do not know how much good they are up to. They have no idea. Now, there are numerous examples of this, it seems to me, in the world of charity and business, the difference between latent and manifest intention, the extraordinary ways in which sometimes apparently purposeless, wasteful things turn out to be far better than doing things in a rationalized, business-like, strategic iron cage. I could talk about other examples, but I've drawn one from here because it's early in the morning and it's post-Easter. And it's the lesson of the bread, or the buns. There's David Hare again. Because business is in some ways quite simple, it's got clearly defined aims. The aim is to make money. Running a hospital is an endless series of judgment calls, where the criteria and objectives are very far from clear. Don't tell me, says Hare, that's easier than making money. He then goes on to talk about teaching in schools and running an A&E department. Why the buns? Abby Day, who writes about intergenerational work in this country in the voluntary sector, talks about the last generation of Generation A adults who are working away in the kitchens of our churches up and down the country. She talks about the fact that when it comes to making buns, this is, on a rational business case, completely and utterly unproductive. Also, by the way, economically wasteful. Somebody goes out to buy the flour, somebody goes to source the currants, somebody goes out to buy the cherries, somebody rolls out the marzipan, somebody buys the butter. 25, 30 women gather in a kitchen and they make hot cross buns. Ladies and gentlemen, they are cheaper at Sainsbury's. Plainly, you can buy a pack of 6 for 50p. You can get a 3 for 2 or 2 for 1 bargain. What is the point of the exercise? The point of the exercise is not to make money, nor is it to produce economically effective buns. What Abby Day says is this: over the conversation in the cooking and the preparing, people are affirmed. They are stroked. They're talked to. Socialization is built. People gather. Water coolers, coffee machines are great examples in companies. In other words, what happens in the act of that activity is that something quite strange happens in that body. Humans discover that they're incomplete. They discover, in the process of being together, that making economically effective buns was not what they gathered for. It was, as it were, to find out how so-and-so was doing after their operation. How is the friend doing before she goes for her operation? How are their kids doing? How are those grandchildren doing who were such a worry? These conversations can happen over cooking because they're not easy to happen over the course of psychotherapy or counselling. But informally, in cooking, they do happen. And society is built up. As I say, it's not economically effective, but it's absolutely about the mutuality of economics. So what can be done? Well, remember a few things if you can. First of all, it seems to me, as Einstein said, some things that count cannot be counted. And some things that can be counted really don't count. That was Einstein. Einstein went on to say that actually for months and years, sometimes he would labour with 99 theses and they'd all be wrong. But on the 100th time, he'd be right. In other words, he was a scientific tactician. He tried things and he knew not everything worked. The Roman playwright Titus Plautus notes the mouse never relies on one hole. Theodore Roosevelt, I'm not a good shot, but I shoot often. Things need to be tried. I want to end then, if I may, on a rabbinic note. The rabbis talk about the fact that if you go back to the very first chapters of Genesis, you'll know that it works through creation sequentially in the course of 6 days, with God having a well-deserved rest on the 7th. God, of course, getting tired and needing a break. The Hebrew word that is used in the first 5 days for every single piece of creation is the word tov. Oceans, tov. Fish, tov. Plants, tov. Animals, tov. Mountain, sky, tov. And tov means good. But, observe the rabbis, when it gets to the creation of you and me, the word tov is withheld. No tov for you and I. The rabbis go on to say, it's not that you and I are not good. It's that that word tov has a much deeper meaning. It's not good. It's good, done and dusted. In other words, it's about completion. And by withholding the word tov at the end for humanity, there's an implicit message in Genesis 1-3. You and I are not complete. We need each other. Tov is withheld because we're not done and dusted. So don't confuse hubris with humility. Remember that we're incomplete. And remember that to be mutual is merely to be human. Thank you very much.